Welcome, welcome specimen, welcome gentlemen and gentlewomen to Saturday. What we're going to be looking at this Saturday is something quite interesting because we are getting close to next week. We're getting close to Tuesday or Wednesday of the chapter 7 of the story release, which is what gives us our double legendary. So we already talked about the specifics. We already talked about the technical things you have to do, you have to get ready for once that week unlocks, get into revered, so you have the reputation needed to craft that legendary at 291 item level, rather than having to use the 265 legendary belt you will get for free. So that part of the PSA for the viewers have already been done. So instead, what we're looking for today is something a little bit more interesting, which is the power, which is what could change, what might change once all of the specs get their power unleashed with their second legendary. Yes, it's not a full picture. It's not a full picture of your power because not everyone has 4 pieces of their tier set, okay? Up to this point, there are going to be people with 4, and then there are going to be people with 1. I don't think there are many people with no tier set yet, mostly because I'm pretty sure they already took their life. If that was the case, after almost a month of the patch, having no tier set pieces would be pretty rough on your sanity. But it is still something worth considering, that even though we are getting closer and closer towards the majority of the players having 4 pieces and therefore unlocking the full strength of your spec that way, not everyone still does. So once you look at the performance in Mythic Plus or the performance in the raid, it might be certain players having a 2-piece, certain players having a 4-piece, certain players having neither. So it is still kind of varying between different players, depending on their luck, I guess. This is not going to be the case for legendaries because on the reset day, on NA or EU, Tuesday or Wednesday, everyone will be able to get their second legendary, regardless of your luck. It's going to be guaranteed. The only change is whether or not you have gotten to revered and you will be able to craft it as a 291 legendary in whichever slot you want, or you haven't gotten to revered and therefore you will have to use the 265 item level belt. That's pretty much the only difference. But as far as the double legendary power, everyone will be on the same level. So let's go and take a look, also based on what we checked a few weeks ago about the power, the covenant plus legendary power of all of the specs, and see if things might change or how big of a change we could have in a few days in terms of the hierarchy, the priority, the meta of the specs in this tier. So we are starting with the least relevant, which is the tank options, because raid encounters are not relevant for tanks. Raid encounters are less about tank power and more about the utility they can bring, the effects they can have, the debuffs or buffs they can bring. So double legendaries are not going to shake things up too much in the raid. For tanks, it's much more relevant in Mythic Plus, the powers they might get in Mythic Plus with their double legendary. So the double legendary power of tanks was quite simple. We only had a couple of specs that gained a significant amount of power from their Covenant legendary, which were Paladin and Druid. Druid already playing or already benefiting from Nightfall and Celestial Spirits, which is a decent legendary, but not as strong as Earth. Reason why it's going to be a good combo for Guardian Druids, and then Prot Paladin, which is already playing with Divine Resonance in Mythic Plus. So now, once you get your second legendary, you will be able to go back as a Prot Paladin to what you were already using in Mythic Plus before Divine Resonance. This is going to be a very powerful combo for Prot Paladin. Unfortunately, for the rest of the tanks, Prot Paladin is already a quite hot option for Mythic Plus. It's already a quite wanted tank, and this new power coming next reset is going to make them even stronger. It's going to make them even more oppressive, specifically for their damage in Mythic Plus. Their double legendary combo is going to be super powerful. Other tanks are not benefiting as much. Prot, Warrior, Blood, Death Knight, Vengeance Demon Hunter even are not gaining too much from their double legendary combo. They are not synergizing too much for Covenant legendary plus the legendary they are using. Brewmaster Monk is likely a little bit stronger, but not as much as the 2 tanks we already mentioned. So it's going to be interesting next reset to see how things change, but as I said, only half as interesting, because this is not really bound to change too much in terms of raid power, but mostly just for Mythic Plus. So it's going to be interesting to see what changes in Mythic Plus when it comes to tanks and their options. Not much seems like it's going to change when it comes to Covenant picks. Imagine right now you are playing a Covenant, but maybe next reset, once you have to play with a Covenant legendary, some specs might choose a completely different Covenant. Doesn't really seem to be the case for tanks at the moment. They are likely to stay in their options that they have gotten before and they have kept for a while now. Vengeance still being Kyrian, Protection Warrior still being Kyrian. You also have Druid still staying Night Fae, Prot Paladin still doing the split. Kyrian for Mythic Plus and Ventir for the raid, for Ashen Hallow. So for tanks, it's mostly not going to change much, which is why we started with tanks. It's going to be the one role with the least amount of changes. Then on we go to healers. So healers are going to have a more of a significant change once we look at the synergy, the power of their double legendary. The first in line for this power was Mistweaver. Mistweaver was first in line because it was the only healer with the Covenant legendary as their best legendary when it comes to the raid. Unfortunately for Mistweaver, their strongest legendary, Sinister Teachings, was nerfed by 50%. So it's perhaps not as strong as it was, but it is still a very good synergy with their other legendary, Ancient Teachings of the Monastery. So they are bound to get a significant power up when it comes to double legendary. The other spec is Discipline Priest. Discipline Priest has Sphere's Harmony as a Kyrian Covenant legendary, which is already their strongest pick in Mythic Plus, and now they will be able to pair it together in the raid with their already strongest pick, which is Clarity of Mind. This is going to make their ramp up and their cooldown windows shorter with Sphere's Harmony and stronger thanks to Sphere's Harmony, which is going to give a significant power up to Discipline Priest in the raid. In Mythic Plus, not as much. In Mythic Plus is not as powerful. There are other specs gaining more synergy in Mythic Plus, like Restoration Shaman, which can use their already strongest option in Mythic Plus, which is a Covenant pick, Raging Vesper Vortex, with another different legendary. So that's also going to be very powerful. But much like we said about Prot Paladin already being the pick of choice in Mythic Plus, Restore Shaman is also already the most picked healer in Mythic Plus. So this Covenant legendary option opening up as a double pick for Restore Shaman is going to benefit them a lot in Mythic Plus, more so than any other healer at the moment. Other healers are not gaining as much from this double legendary combo. You do have Holy Paladin, which could gain a lot if we assume that the Necrolord build is going to be a thing in Red Encounters. If it isn't, then it's kind of on the weak side. Same goes for Holy Priest. Don't get fooled. Holy Priest right now is being played a lot by World First guilds and even normal guilds in Mythic progression or even Heroic progression. But that has nothing to do with the double legendary. The double legendary of Holy Priest is quite, technically speaking, shit. They are not gaining too much. If they are likely to stay in their Simp build in the raid, if they are staying Night Fae, their Covenant legendary for Night Fae is quite weak. It's an even extra help in giving out more damage to your DPS, but it's not nearly as powerful or synergistic with their current legendary. So that's not what made Holy Priest strong in this tier. So not really to be considered. It's not really gonna shake things up too much for Holy Priest. As I said, the more interesting picks when it comes to double legendary next week is going to be seeing Restore Shaman and Discipline Priest in Mythic Plus with their double legendary combo, and Mystery Monk and even Resto Druid in Red Encounters with their double legendary combo. Those are going to be the bigger standout picks when it comes to healers. Again, when it comes to Covenant options, Covenant choices, not much is going to change. The only relevant change is it is still likely to be Holy Priest and Shaman. Shaman being Necrolord in the raid and Kyrian in Mythic Plus, and then Holy Priest being Night Fae in the raid and Kyrian in Mythic Plus. Those are the more likely changes that will continue next week, as they have been for the entirety of this tier so far. Now on to the more juicy part of the video, which is of course the DPS. Starting with the melee DPS. The melee DPS are in a pretty interesting situation because the two strongest specs with the best synergy when it comes to double legendary are not very popular right now. They are not very powerful right now. So it's going to be even more interesting to see what happens next week. If we have a complete reversal, a 180 of priority of these specs because of their power up in their double legendary synergy, My spoiler would be no. Even more so, no Megalul as the response, because the two specs in question are Ret Paladin and Feral Druid. So the reason why they are one of the strongest is because they already play with their Covenant legendary. Celestial Spirits for Druid and Divine Resonance for Ret Paladin. So once they can use two legendaries, they can pick and choose one of their normal legendaries to pair with their Covenant legendary. That's what gives them such good synergy. Other specs that are on a similar level are the two rogue specs, Assassination and Subtlety, playing with the Kyrian Covenant legendary, Obedience, and Havoc, that can play in the raid with the Ventir Covenant legendary, Agony Gaze. So these are the specs that gain the most value from being able to use two legendaries because of the strength of their Covenant options. Other specs are not as lucky. Other specs have much more of a garbage choice in their Covenant picks, like DK specs. Both Frost and Unholy don't really want to play with a Covenant legendary. They would much rather combine two of their normal legendaries together if they could. Their Covenant legendary options are not very powerful. Warrior specs, both of them, whether they're going Kyrian or Night Fae, the damage increase of the Spear of Bastion Covenant legendary and the Ancient Aftershock Covenant legendary are not nearly as powerful as some of these other melee specs. It is also unlikely we're gonna get some major Covenant swap. Imagine a situation where right now one of your normal Covenant legendary is the strongest and Kyrian is your best Covenant. But then, once you can use two legendaries, the Covenant legendary of Night Fae makes more sense for you. So you're going to be swapping from Kyrian to Night Fae overnight because of your double legendary synergy. Not really the case for melee DPS, for most of them anyways. There might be the case for something like Survival because of the power of Pouch of Razor Fragments over Kyrian, perhaps. It might be a possibility. Another example, a little bit more likely, is Havoc. Havoc has ditched Agony Gaze to go back to Night Fae. It's less about the power of the legendary itself and more about the multiple instances of multi-target damage you can have. Back when you can use two legendaries, perhaps they might go back to Ventir for single target fights, for example. Not too many other examples. Maybe Enhancement Shaman, yes. I guess Enhancement Shaman, which has been juggling between Covenants for the whole expansion, between Necrolord, Night Fae, Ventir, so depending on their Covenant pick, which should be Night Fae next reset, once they get their double legendary power, we might see a change for Enhancement as well. But this situation is mostly going to be interesting just to see if we see any change in the power hierarchy of melee specs. As we said, the current best synergies are for specs like Ret and Feral, which are not doing too well, and now we have specs that are doing well so far in this tier, like Frost Death Knight, which is not really going to get a good double legendary power. Arms Warrior is also doing very well, Fury Warrior is also doing very well, Enhancement is doing very well, and their power-ups are not going to be massive, so it's going to be interesting to see if anything changes on the melee side of DPS. Now it's time to move on the ranged side of the DPS. When it comes to ranged, we did look at the double legendary power weeks ago, and we summarized that the best ones in line were going to be Balance Druid and the two Hunter specs. Those were the ones with the strongest power from their combo. Druid is likely to be still the main pick of choice, the one to look for next reset because of Sinful Hysteria. As we know, last tier, Balance Druid was a Ventir pick with their Covenant legendary. So next reset, they will be able to still use Sinful Hysteria together with what they are using right now, which is Primordial Arcanic Pulsar. It's going to be a very powerful combo, so that's going to be likely, especially once we pointed out in the last few days that Balance Druid is not performing too well in terms of damage so far in the raid. So it's going to be interesting to see how much of this is going to help, how much of this double legendary power is going to help Balance Druid regain their top spot that they held pretty much the entire expansion, as far as range DPS at the very least. Other specs. Now, we do have the opposite, I guess, discussion for Demonology Warlock. Much like Balance Druid is towards the bottom right now, but at the top of double legendary synergy, Demonology Warlock is currently at the top of range DPS performances so far, but their double legendary synergy is as a politician would say, fucking garbage. They're decaying soul satchel, if they stay Night Fae, which is very likely, is terrible. It's not really that powerful, so it's gonna be interesting to see with other range DPS specs gaining more power from their double legendary if Demonology will retain its spot or if it's gonna lose ranks over time because of this lack of power from their double legendary. To be fair, range DPS do not change too much with their double legendary power. That doesn't seem to be a major surprise in terms of picks and options. This is also because many of the ranged picks are not Covenant legendaries, because their Covenant legendaries are not very strong. Unlike Melee, where many of them, multiples of them, had strong Covenant legendaries. Paladins, Druids, Rogues even had powerful Covenant legendaries. For ranged DPS, not really. Besides for Balanced Druid, and I guess the outlier of Sinful Hysteria, most of the other Covenant legendaries of ranged DPS are not powerful at all. You do have Hunters, as I said, that do have some pretty good power-ups possible. Fragments of the Elder Antlers in particular is one of their good picks. The Kyrian option as well, which does something similar to Fragments of the Elder Antlers in terms of burst damage. Besides those specs, however, most of the others are quite depressing. The Mage specs, the Covenant legendaries of Mage specs are not powerful at all. Shadow Priest legendaries for Covenants after being nerfed, the Necrolord one, the Palette Command one is not as exciting either. Elemental Shaman doesn't have too much synergy with their Covenant legendaries. Warlock specs are a disaster when it comes to Covenant legendaries, so unfortunately, when it comes to double legendary power-up, the increase for range DPS is going to be lower. It's going to be less exciting than melee DPS, even less than healers actually. Healers are much more diverse and interesting in terms of power-ups compared to range DPS. When it comes to Covenant options though, perhaps there is going to be a switch in Covenants because of the power of certain Covenant legendaries. It's unlikely. We have stayed with this wall of Night Fae for the entire expansion. You have seen me lament this problem for range DPS for a long time. As you can see here, it's a Night Fae fiesta. It's unlikely to change, as I said. The only one that is bound to change is Balanced Druid, if they can go back to Sinful Hysteria and if they can go back to playing with their Ventier build, essentially. Besides Balanced Druid, however, there doesn't seem to be too much of a change on the horizon for all of these specs. So it is going to be less interesting compared to what we looked at for the melee DPS in terms of power-ups. Yes, it's going to be interesting for balance to see how strong is this synergy of Balanced Druid for double legendary and how weak is the synergy of the double legendary for Demonology, the two specs currently having the biggest, I guess, swing in power. Besides these two specs, Balance and Demo, the change to the other range DPS specs is likely not going to be as visible, not going to be as huge compared to some of the other melee specs, for example, and even healers. So it's going to be slightly less interesting to see the changes of the range DPS once they get a hold of their double legendary. With this being said, we had our overview of the upcoming major change, the last of the major changes of this patch. I wouldn't call the creation catalyst and being able to craft your tier pieces one of the major changes. I think the unlocking of the double legendary is going to be the last of the big changes. So we're going to be waiting for just a few days before we can start seeing any meaningful changes in the next reset of the raid, the next reset of Mythic Plus. And as we said already, unlike the tier sets, this is going to be a much quicker, a much more easily visible set of changes because everyone will get access to the double legendary immediately, unlike the tier set acquisition, which could last weeks for the more unlucky of the player base. So I guess all that's left now is to just wait and see how these changes are going to impact the meta, are going to impact the power of all of the different specs in the different activities. For now, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend, the rest of your Saturday. So thank you, of course, guys, for watching the video and for helping to grow this channel. You can also do more, contribute more by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel. For this Saturday only, the subscription button is going to be left unlocked to everyone who has reached Revered or will reach Revered by Tuesday or Wednesday, the reset day, and will be able to craft their Covenant Legendary at 291 item level in whichever slot they want. Now, as always, you can also follow me on Twitter. Over here, I've heard tales of people actually reading one of my tweets several months ago, so you might be lucky and catch one. And then also you can support me on Patreon over here. If you have a terminal illness and you want to do some good as one of your last deeds on this earth, please go ahead. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I have a request for a World of Warcraft. Could I get a tier piece at 265 item level? Could I get a heroic tier piece? Is it too much to ask? I'm just wondering, okay? I'm not pressuring you, game. I'm just curious.